You're listening to the People Agenda podcast, brought to you by leading HR, workforce and payroll transformation specialist, Lace Partners. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the People Agenda podcast. It's me, Chris Howard from Lace Partners, joining you as always for our latest edition of our pod. And today I'm particularly interested to get into this one, and it's quite timely at the time of not just recording, but also releasing. We're actually going to fast track today's podcast. Normally we run about 3 weeks or 4 weeks in advance for our podcasts, but I wanted to get this one out just before we hit the end of October, and that's because at the moment, at the time of recording, and certainly by the time we release, it is Black History Month, which is the month of October. And we've been doing some initiatives at Lace Partners internally just to raise kind of awareness, and I'm going to get my co-host to just talk about that for a minute or two in a second before we introduce our guest, or we might just introduce our guest first and then get my co-host to do some speaking on that front. But we wanted to really just speak about some of the interesting challenges that individuals and organizations face as well when they're trying to navigate some of the challenges around DE&I. And we haven't done a pod around some of the challenges and issues that individuals, companies, collective groups of people face. And so we thought it'd be quite nice to, at this time when there's a lot of awareness being raised around Black History Month, to talk a little bit about that. As always, I need a co-host. Co-host making a debut this time, it's Christina Adeniyi. How you doing, Christina? You all right?
Yes, I'm very well, thank you.
Christina and I have known each other for blooming years, but I've never managed to drag her on the pod, and now she's on. So I'm glad and grateful to have you on as my co-host for today.
Finally twisted my arm.
Finally twisted your arm in a subject you're quite passionate about. And we're going to bring in our guest in a second. But actually, before we do that, do you want to just talk a little bit around some of the bits that we've been doing, maybe a minute or two?
Yeah, so we're very enthusiastic about raising awareness around all things DE&I, but especially around Black History Month. The intention is always to try and inform our team so that we can be better allies to one another at work. So this year, the theme was standing firm in power and pride. And it was also looking and reflecting on the anniversary of the 1965 Race Relations Act. So just to give you an idea of the sort of things we've been doing in the office, we decided that a portrait gallery would be a really nice way to give a visual view of the timeline between prior to the 1965 Act and then to where we are now, and looking at what changed, why the Act was introduced, where we are now, and what change needs to happen and what progress have we made. And within that, we've been highlighting some of the people that pioneered for this and activists from historically, from when the Act came about to now, because it's an ongoing thing, as everybody knows. Equality is not something that we've completely mastered, so therefore we are always fighting towards that. So we've used this time to really highlight those people and hopefully spread awareness and introduce people to ideas that they didn't know and people that they didn't know. So it's a real celebration of power and pride.
I love that. And I love that word celebration as well. I think that's really important. As an example, really cool thing that has just gone out on our Microsoft Teams today, which was around just raising the awareness of the Baroness Floella Benjamin and some of the background that she's got. And there's a really good video that you can watch. And we talked about on our Teams messages why that story matters. And there were some questions for people to think about as well. And we want people to think about how they engage in the workplace. And we've got an expert that we wanted to talk to. So I should introduce her, because Christina, we're 4 minutes in and I haven't even introduced our guest now. It's very remiss of me. So I'm going to do that right now. It's Lildonia Lawrence, who is a diversity and inclusion consultant and a well-being coach. And she runs her own business called Move with Lildonia. How are you doing? You all right?
I'm very good. Thank you. So glad to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. It is great to have you on. Now, I want to get you to talk to our lovely listeners a little bit about your background. But before we do that, one of the traditions that we have on this pod is a fundamentally different question. And if you are listening into the podcast for the very first time, that is completely random, not related to HR or the topic that we are talking about today. So it's a little bit of a fun icebreaker that we wanted to get into before we talk about some of the more serious and important celebratory elements of today's pod, as Christina mentioned. My question, which I'll go first because I want to give you guys the opportunity to have a think about this, but at the time of releasing this, it will be coming up to Halloween. It might even be Halloween. And so I've been thinking about what's the best dress Halloween costume I can think of, or that I've seen through social medias or anything like that. And one thing that I just thought about just before we were recording is the sorting hat. I'm a Harry Potter obsessive, and the idea of going not just as somebody wearing the sorting hat, but an entire head-to-toe sorting hat amused me, because my first choice was Deadpool, but the skin-tight outfit doesn't really work for my body shape, my middle-aged man body shape. But Lildonia, what are you going with?
Oh, I couldn't think of one that I'd love, but I can think of the best one that I've ever done was when I was Black Swan.
Oh, amazing.
And it was completely quite random, but my sister painted me all over white. Shout out to her. That was fantastic. I had my lovely tutu. And I just remember going out and turning a corner and bumping into a stranger and then being frightened out of their life. So that's one of my fondest memories of a pretty out there costume.
Love it. Absolutely love it. Christina, what are you going with?
I'm not sure if I'd wear this, but I think this is one we're going to see lots of this year. I think we're going to see lots of life-size Labubus running around, because I don't know if you know what they are, Chris. Did you know? I could tell by I could tell the shaking of the head. A Labubu is this. It's a small teddy bear that was made by an artist, I think from Japan, and it's been taken on as like a keyring that you now put on your designer handbags, but then all the kids love them and they've sold out everywhere. And they're not the most cute looking things you've ever seen. They have fang teeth, so they're slightly scary, but everybody's going absolutely mad to go out and find them and buy them. So I think we're going to see a lot of life-size Labubus walking around trick-or-treating this year. That's just a guess.
I feel like I've heard that too. I think I've heard that too. What we haven't heard, though, is an intro from our guest. Talk to our listeners a little bit about your background and some of the work that you do with your clients as well.
Yes, thank you so much. So yes, I have a couple of different strands which intersect, and that is I do a lot of well-being work. I go into organizations, I help and support teams be happier, healthier, more resilient in general as people, and of course that reflects at work. And then I also do the other part, which we're going to talk about a lot today, which is about inclusion, diversity, and anti-racism. So I support organizations to become more equitable places through training, supporting with policy, delivering workshops, sometimes through longer times, working on service delivery. So all elements of the business really to support people to have generally happier, healthier, and more equitable environments for their employees, for their staff, and for their service users and clients.
Love it. So what we're going to do is Christina and I are probably going to fire a load of questions at you. I hope you're ready, because I think this is it's a very interesting topic. But what I guess my first sort of question before I give Christina having it is more around the types of things that businesses come and talk to you about, because we will have HR directors, we'll have chief people officers listening in, we'll have people that work across the HR spectrum for organizations that might be a few hundred up to 10,000, 20,000. So I guess my first question is just getting an idea of the types of things that people are coming to you at the moment. And also, I guess a sub question within that is how much has that changed in certainly the last 5-6 years?
That's a really fantastic question. It has definitely changed over the last 5 or 6 years since the pandemic, because there was really an awareness of these topics because the whole world was silent and all we had to do was listen. So during that time, I saw a real increase of inquiries, companies reaching out to me. And I also see a big increase whenever there is a time connected to something related to racism. So, for example, if there are any racial riots or things like that, I will always get a lot more inquiries. And what organizations tend to want from me is either support to develop policy. So maybe they've got an EDI policy, or they've got an anti-racism policy, or they've got a constitution, and they know what they want to say. They really want to be inclusive and equitable employers for their staff, but they don't quite know the right wording or language, or know what they should, or in quote marks, shouldn't be saying. So that's one that I often get. And another one is training. So I get two strands when it comes to training: spaces that are trying to be more inclusive across the board for their diverse cohorts of staff. So I might do, for example, anti-racism training. So general awareness can be raised, or so that managers feel more comfortable supporting staff who are from racialized minorities. Or organizations that have clients. So they might have a really diverse cohort of clients and want to make sure that their business is really inclusive as possible, from service delivery, from marketing, all elements of the business. So those are the main ways that I really provide support.
I said I'll let Christina have a go, but I'm already interrupting her and myself here, because I'm interested in what you talked about, the manager training there. On our podcast, and as a HR consultancy, we spend a lot of time talking about the fact that good people managers and line managers aren't always the same thing. You don't just get given a manual, or you don't get a chip imprinted to say you're going to be a good line manager and here's the things that you need to think of. Now, the angle that we often go at Lace Partners is, of course, things like employee value proposition, or it's around performance management or things like that. But we obviously don't touch on that crucial part, which is working with individuals from different backgrounds, with different cultural backgrounds as well. What sort of advice can you give to businesses that are thinking about this sort of thing? And what's the sort of key things that you tend to pull out from that manager training?
So it's a couple of things. There's a values-based element to it. So the majority of organizations that I work with have strong values around looking after their people. But you can only look after your people if you're looking after the entirety of them. And things like race, ethnicity, culture, and various other intersections of people identities are often either suppressed or not being able to bring to work. So a big part of my training is increasing knowledge, awareness, and comfortability of talking about these topics. For example, when we see things like, I'm based in Bristol, London born and bred, but based in Bristol now. There were a lot of riots across the city the year before we were recording this in 2024. And a lot of people who are racially marginalized were scared to go to work. So they would have to work from home and things like that. Now, ideally, we would want someone to be able to speak to their manager about it. And we would want a manager of any background, any demographic, to feel comfortable to have that conversation. It might not be always an easy conversation, but we want them to be able to feel that they can do it. So a massive part of it is raising confidence around that, because talking about race, ethnicity, and culture can feel really scary. And I want to reduce some of that fear, because we all have culture, we all have ethnicity, we all have a background. So I want to demystify it, and that's a really big part of it.
Is that a common theme that where you've said about people being apprehensive? Do you find that's difficult then to get people to have conversations in the workplace? So when you're training managers, does it take time to get them to understand that they don't have to get everything right, that they're there to learn, and that mistakes will be made, and from that we hope we learn? So how do you deal with that? How do you get people to open up?
So my approach whenever I'm working with organizations is I'm very anti-cancel culture. These days, with social media, with X, with Instagram and so on, there's very much of, if a person makes, in quote marks, a mistake, they're called out, they're cancelled. An organization, we don't buy from them, we don't shop from them. Of course, there are some times when things can be really catastrophic, but more often than not, it's a lack of knowledge and a mistake. And we're all learning every single day. And it's with that learning that growth occurs. So I very much approach teams and managers with an anti-cancel culture approach. And it's like, we all have to learn this together. It's all of our responsibilities. And that usually helps people feel a bit softer and know that it's a safer space to ask questions, make mistakes, come back to me in 6 months to review things and go from there, really.
So when you're talking to companies and managers, for example, and if you identify areas where there is a need for improvement, how do people respond? What is the response you get when you say there's something here that you're doing that isn't particularly correct? So do you find that people find that difficult to take?
I would say on a whole, organizations respond quite well. However, I would say that sometimes there are particular individuals that might take things very personally. So if there's an individual that maybe doesn't respond to criticism, although I'll never criticize, but if they don't respond to criticism well, it can be quite challenging. So one thing that's really important when organizations are working towards equity goals or inclusion goals is I like to get people on the same base, singing from the same hymn sheet. So if you have a cohort of board members or a cohort of partners, you want to get it to that everyone has the same base of understanding, and regardless of maybe slight differences in personality or personal views, from a professional organizational perspective, here is where we're going. And when you start from, or when you get to that base, the response tends to be better, because then you can say, okay, we've set out our objectives and values here. This isn't aligning. What do we need to do to make a change? And that tends to work out better. Where I come into organizations where they haven't thought about any of the background, but they maybe want me to come in and look at implementation, it's a lot harder. So I always like to start from scratch and get everyone in a position of responsibility at the same pace and up to speed.
So here's a question that I've got for you, because obviously there are lots of, there's talk and there's been talks of there's companies hitting diversity targets. And I hear the word diversity target and it makes me feel a little uncomfortable, because in my head, utopia is that you don't need a target for something like this. It should just be something that's ingrained within your culture. So can I just get some thoughts around, I guess, some of the ways in which, I guess, the transformative effects that you've been able to see within leaders and businesses, and also getting them to the point where they're seeing this as, actually, this is going to add value to our business. Because if we make people feel more inclusive, if we have a wider pool of talent that we're able to draw from, there's a whole load of documented benefits around being more inclusive as an organization. But can I just get your steer or your take on some of those conversations that you have with organizations, with entities?
Diversity targets can be a real challenge. I understand why organizations put them in place, but I always encourage to work around values and culture. Of course, like you said, Chris, it's noted across all elements of diversity. Diverse organizations and diverse teams have more benefits in terms of creativity, productivity, idea generation, and all of those kind of things. However, if you create a diverse team just for the sake of it, there's a chance that the team and the space will still not be inclusive, because there won't be a values-based space. For example, when we think about the construct of racism, for example, it's not something that is just, if you're a person of color, you may not display this discriminatory behavior. If you're not a person of color, you do. If you haven't created an environment that is an anti-racist environment, regardless of who you have in the teams, the environment will not be inclusive and allow all people to thrive. So it's really important to focus on that. What are the values that we want to create? What's the environment that we want to create? And can we create safety, comfortability, and a space where people can show up as themselves with all facets of diversity? And that is so important. And that might come from policies, it might come from a marketing perspective, it might come from things like you mentioned, like what you do in awareness weeks or months, and being able to have these conversations. So if someone experiences something challenging inside of work or outside of work related to their marginalization, can they be open about it? Will they get support? Can they come and speak to their partner that is responsible for their team? Things like that, so important.
And on the subject of DI, given that it's been a big topic politically, and we've heard about big companies that have rolled back their DEI initiatives, how do we tackle that? How do you go in and show people that, for example, Chris made the point, we shouldn't really need this, but we know we do. So how do we continue to ensure that companies understand the importance and the value in that?
I think for some companies, it really, if you want to look at it from a bottom line, it's things like staff retention, it's things like income generation, it's things like thinking if every marginalized person or racially minoritized person that comes in leaves within 2 years, what is that going to be the impact of the business? One of the things that I did throughout the years of the pandemic is work as a well-being coach for professionals in primary and secondary care in the NHS and in social services. And I would hear repeatedly the same stories of people either being othered, experiencing microaggression, being overlooked for promotion, not being able to bring themselves to work in terms of maybe faith, cultural holidays, things like that. And people ended up getting burnt out. Absenteeism and presenteeism was so high, and all they wanted to do is come to work and do the job that they loved. Actually, if we work from both sides, supporting people with their well-being, but then also from a top-down perspective, it's better for the organization all round. So we can look at it from a values base, but also on a financial perspective, it's really major.
When you're talking as well, we've talked about the perspective of the companies and like how they're responding, but given that things have for DEI have been quite precarious at the moment, people not feeling quite emboldened to completely pull back on it. Have you seen any reaction from like the workforce when you go into companies and how individuals feel about that? Maybe the marginalised groups within those organisations. What is the feedback that you're getting from them?
So it's a mix. Of course, I'm here in the UK. It's been much, much worse when I've worked with American companies, unfortunately. I'm dual citizen, American, UK, US myself. And here we're still lucky in a way that we can still talk about it. We can still have those conversations, and people are not at fear in such a major way of losing jobs when using these words and language, but there is still an energy of hesitation at the moment. And what I'm finding is that people who are racially minoritized are actually experiencing more burnout because they don't feel that they have a safe space to talk about the things that are going on. So when things are happening, or on a mass scale, we're seeing things about racism in the media, or people getting attacked, or use of flags in a way to display hatred and not true patriotism. And then people have to just go to work and try and function. Actually, people are not going to be able to function because they're frightened, they're anxious, they're nervous. And these are the things that organizations ideally should not be scared to speak up about. But there is a real fear.
I think it's a really interesting point you made there about burnout, the flag stuff as well. That's about not being able to bring your full self to work, isn't it? A couple of days ago, I didn't get a good night's sleep. And so I wasn't able to be my 100% productive self the next day. If you're going to work and you are experiencing things like that are impacting you, are putting you on edge, you are also not able to be as 100% productive because that's sticking in your mind. Why is that up here? And like, how does this make me feel? So I do think that's a really interesting point. We've got about 5 minutes left. I want to ask about HR's role and something else, but I just wanted to check in with Christina whether or not there was anything else you wanted to cover, because I didn't want to cut you off, and I can see in your eyes you're like, I want to ask this question.
There is one thing.
Do you want to fire away?
I think it plays into that, as I mentioned before, that we're really keen to make sure that we create good allyships for people within our company. So, for example, if someone is feeling that way, they do have people they can come to talk to, and that person will understand, because we're trying to spread awareness, educate, inform. But one of the things that I saw when I was looking at your website was that you were talking about bystander intervention. Can you explain a bit about that? Because I think that's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, so I do deliver specific bystander intervention training for organizations, which means developing the skills and confidence to intervene when you see something that is incorrect or causing harm to another person. Now, when it comes to allyship, which means to be an active supporter of a group that experiences discrimination, we all have the capacity to be an ally. So I am a non-disabled person. I aim to be a really strong ally for the disabled community. I have men in my life who try their best to be allies for women. And so it's a circular thing. I think sometimes it can be thought of a lot that there's a baddie and there's a goodie. That's not the case. We all have certain levels of privilege, and we all have certain levels of disadvantage. And if we use our levels of privilege to support people who are experiencing disadvantage, in theory, we should all be supporting each other. Being an active bystander is not putting the emotional burden on the person who's experiencing discrimination to have to speak out. So in an organization, it might be, there was a time I was working in an organization and we had a work WhatsApp chat, and someone said something really quite racist in the work WhatsApp chat. And I got a lot of messages privately on WhatsApp saying, I stand with you. What this person said was really wrong. But no one actually spoke up in the WhatsApp chat and said, actually, what you've said to Lildonia is incorrect. And I was the only person of color in that group of 40 professionals. And I had to leave the WhatsApp group because for me, it wasn't safe enough to be there. And one of my good friends and colleagues is in that group. And she has said, I have learned from that I was not a strong ally, because if I could do that another time round, I would speak out in that group. And it doesn't always have to be aggressive, but something as simple as, what you've said is unkind. I would ask you not to use language like that anymore in this setting, and then taking it from there. So it's really building up that confidence to be able to speak out when we see it.
Yeah, and that's strength as well, particularly if you're in an environment where you feel, oh, how's this going to come back to me? If that's probably one of the biggest worries that people face, but actually it's almost worse if you leave it uncovered, because things can just foster and fester. And particularly if you've got organizations that are fast growing, if that's a WhatsApp group of 40, what happens if the organization is in a few years' time 200, and you've naturally got more diverse that occurs as a result of it? I wanted to ask you one quick question, or one final, if that's all right, before we run out of time today. And I guess it relates back to, obviously, the people that listen into this, they work in the HR function. They work for people directors and chief people officers and chief human resource officers. So what's your kind of message, or one or two pieces of advice? Because we've talked today great stuff about allyship around, I'm really interested about the bystander intervention stuff, because I think that's quite fascinating in terms of people being able to say, do you know what, I can do my bit. So for me personally as well, and this doesn't even apply just to work, like in social media environments, in personal environments, if you're in the pub and you hear that stuff, it's not okay. It's acceptable, and it should be championed. People being able to say, do you know what? If I take a pub example, that's unacceptable, and I'm going to take my business elsewhere. But what's your kind of final bit of advice to HR professionals listening in on what they can do, what their role is to play?
Yeah, I've got two things actually. My first thing is to say, in a positive way, to work in a role, in a function of HR is a massive privilege, because you have the opportunity to enrich the lives of so many employees. So there's a real space for goodness and positivity, which is a responsibility and a massive privilege. But the second thing I would really mention is, like any other thing that we learn in life, to become anti-racist or to become equitable or to become inclusive is a skill. It's not something we're born with. So in the same way people would go to university or do a CPD course or go on training days, we are learning this skill of becoming allies, of becoming anti-racist. We're moving through the stages of learning from ignorance all the way, probably not to mastery, but somewhere up to competence. And then we cycle through it. We start to learn again. And I think if people see it in that way of just another skill that they're continuously working on, it won't be that fear of, I have to get it right or I'm terrible. I have to succeed or I fail. That black and white thinking when it comes to this doesn't help us. If we continue thinking about it as a learning process, I think that's going to be really helpful for HR professionals on this journey.
Yeah, I really love that. Christina, was there any final sort of point that you wanted to make? Because I saw I want to ask a final question.
I was just going to say, in terms of the bystander thing, it's incredibly powerful when one person makes that decision to call out something that isn't right. It doesn't, like you said, and Chris, to your points, socially or professionally, that's super important. That's all I was going to say. But I was going to ask you as well, because while we're on the pod, you've got a book.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And a podcast. I thought you might want to shout us things.
Yeah. So I've got my book, Back Yourself, A Wellbeing Guide to Healing from Racial Trauma. And that's a book specifically for people who are racially minoritized, which can be anyone, but also we're thinking about anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, ethno-religions as well. Anyone that experiences discrimination, this is a self-care guide for you. And also I've got my podcast Intersections, which is all about the different ways in which our intersectional identities overlap. Please do check those out, and you can find them on my website, which I think will be linked in the show notes.
Yep, we'll do them in the show notes, both the book and the pod as well, for sure.
Lovely.
Top stuff. Listen, Lildonia, it's been amazing having you on. Thank you very much for sharing a bit of your time today, some of your experiences with clients and personal stuff as well. Really valuable. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Take care.
Yes. And Christina, thank you very much for co-hosting.
Oh, you're very welcome. I enjoyed it.
Yes, good fun. It was good fun. Hopefully you've enjoyed this as much as we have enjoyed recording it. As I said, if you check the show notes, if you're listening into this whilst you're on the way to work or anything like that, then you can see more details about the book and also the podcast and also the work Lildonia does as well. But there's nothing left for me to say today other than thank you very much for listening, and hopefully we'll catch you next time on the People Agenda podcast. Bye-bye.